get too much into that, only because then we will never get to the 21st century. But it's a good question, and I didn't bring. I will have more sculpture later on. I didn't bring in much early on, because there were constructivist sculptors and supremacist sculptors who were working alongside Malevich. And also, if you think even back to somebody like Picasso, who also, in essence, tried to replicate this idea of fracturing the pictorial plane, if you will, in sculpture, or recreating this idea of being able to see multiple points of view of a single object simultaneously in sculpture. A lot of what happens then in abstract sculpture is also a reference to what Picasso does with sculpture. The other thing that's important to think about is, and again, this is embodied by Picasso and goes forward, is the use of unconventional materials, or sort of collage or assemblage. That becomes really important. So the idea of art doesn't necessarily need to be confined to the traditional materials. And I didn't at all, and I wasn't planning on it, talk about Dada, which was happening really at the same time. So in the early 1910s, teens. And there was a lot of Dada sculpture, particularly, that was being made, but also performance and poetry and and that kind of thing. And the idea with Dada that relates to someone like Kandinsky and Malevich and Mondrian is still the idea that the world that we live in as we know it can no longer be the sort of the basis for art, that you need to go beyond the representational world and the rational world to find inspiration for art. So, Dada artists embrace sort of anarchy and chaos because they felt that by trusting, authority or trusting the rational, that's what got us into the World War in the first place, and so you have to reject all of that. So in a sense, it's kind of a different means, but using similar kinds of ideas. The fact that no longer does this sort of Renaissance notion of art making hold true anymore. We have to look to other kinds of sources. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Okay. So with Mondrian, I love this kind of image where you can see one of the things that if you think about a Mondrian, probably the first thing that comes to mind for anyone who knows anything about Mondrian is the image on the bottom right. But I think it's something that's important to know that he started out as a figurative artist. He was really painting very representationally. He was influenced by academic landscape and still life painting, and particularly Dutch Impressionism. And so even though the tree on the upper left-hand quadrant is beginning to show sort of his move towards a rejection of the natural representational world, just even in terms of playing with color a little bit and beginning to simplify the form of the tree. You can see how ultimately, as Mondrian continues to work, he finds that abstraction, again, becomes the best visual vocabulary for conveying these loftier ideas about the world around them, about what he would call universal truths. And Mondrian also writes extensively about this, and is one of the two sort of founders, primary founders of the Dutch group, the De Stijl, so the style group, that was founded in 1917, and they too published a manifesto, because all of these artists are publishing their manifestos and their books and their writings about what they were trying to do, particularly through abstraction.
So what do you say that's abstract and not non-objective?
The bottom right, I guess we would say, ultimately, Mondrian would say is non-objective.
Okay.
That he is, left behind.
So he's
Yeah,
sort of
exactly.
part of the, okay.
Right. But you can see that he sort of simplifies until he gets to the point that it's really purely about form and color and line and shape. And this, for him too, much like Malevich, sort of an equilibrium that's reached in terms of the formal elements. So there's a balance or an equilibrium. And it's kind of, for Mondrian too, this sort of push-pull as well. And that, we saw a little bit of that with Malevich with that black square, red square, this idea that's kind of push-pull. They're equivalents as opposed to being, say, exact equals. I want to play a little video for you of Nancy Troy talking about Mondrian's place in art history. So I'm going to go ahead and it's a very, very quick video. Pop right up here. And you can find this on the museum's SFMOMA's website too.
Abstraction before it was practiced. Synonyms. To abandon representation completely was to cut loose from the very thing that made you a painter or a sculptor to begin with.
He began to work on a series of pictures, and as he worked through a process of abstraction and simplification, starting with an object or a building or a scene in nature, stripping away the details to arrive at a kind of fundamental underlying structure. And in doing so, he focused on horizontal and vertical elements. During the teens, when he was in the Netherlands, he focused on a few images, one of them being a church in Hamburg and the facade of that church, but another famous one was a scene where a series of piers met the ocean. And he was able to see in these relations a series of horizontals and verticals that he eventually sort of simplified into horizontal and vertical lines, working with charcoal as he did in this series of drawings of the church in Hamburg. He wanted to suppress physical space or physicality itself. And ultimately, he brought these horizontal and vertical elements together to create a kind of realism on the canvas itself that would suggest opposites coming together in a dynamic equilibrium.
So I wanted to just show you briefly that video, because I think that it, well, A, because you've got the drawing of the church facade, and so it's nice to also see, a bit of the reference to not only the image of the church itself, but then his, realistic drawing and representation of it. But also then how he is, as he does in this sort of image of the tree, sort of reducing the formal elements down to their essences, to their bare minimum, extracting the detail, making it less representational and more about this kind of almost symbolic language for the church, or the symbolic language maybe for the tree. And so and here's the drawing here that you have. But if you think about then dish style, right? And you've got Mondrian on the left, and you have Theo van Doesburg on the right, the two founders of this style, and the two central figures. Van Doesburg being actually the main spokesperson for the style, and Mondrian being really sort of the principal investigator of the style. you have these two artists who are, again, trying to find a visual vocabulary that can express this utopian vision about the idea that you need to reject the representational world, and specifically they were also rejecting what they considered the decorative excess of Art Nouveau, so a style of the day, in favor of a simple, logical style that they said was appropriate for every aspect of modern life. So this language sounds very much like the Bauhaus, the idea that art should be representative of the way that you should then live your life. Art and life are one, there is no gap. And so Gestalt is really sort of centered on the fundamental principle of geometry, of the straight line, the square, the rectangle, and this sort of clean, spare, rational, reduced palette. So when you think about Mondrian, you think about Mondrian as adhering to the idea that you're only going to use black, white, and the primary colors, the building blocks of all other colors, right? And you heard Nancy Troy talk about the fact too that it needed to be verticals and horizontals. And he held so firmly to that belief that when Theo van Doesburg decides a little later on that he's going to introduce the diagonal and secondary colors, literally their friendship just disintegrated because Mondrian was like, you're breaking the rules here that we set up. Because for Mondrian, the straight line tells the truth, and it's that dynamic equilibrium of the vertical and the horizontal that was so key to him. For Mondrian, the diagonal introduced all kinds of movement, so it was no longer stable. It introduced a different kind of sense of space, and that was not what Mondrian was particularly interested in. And so it was upsetting this kind of, utopian vision for what art should be and how art then reflected the way your life should be. So it was unacceptable. Which I think is, again, this is how firmly these artists really are sort of buying into these theories and this rhetoric and and the manifestos that they're writing and putting out there. Yes?
Did these artists ever create or live in utopian communities?
That's kind of. I'd say that also in terms of just kind of bonding together, as artistic practitioners, they would sort of do so. Yeah, exactly. They kind of almost had to create their own bubble, right? One of the things that's particularly interesting, though, just about our Mondrian piece is the idea that, which I know is not, this piece is not in your show, but it is interesting to think about, just as we looked at Franz Marc's piece, where it was a work that was completely finished and then the artist went back and made changes. This is another example of that in practice. So Mondrian, in 1935, finishes and exhibits the work on the right. He then has to leave Europe and he immigrates to the United States, as many European artists were doing, on the eve of World War II. And so when he gets to New York, he decides to rework his composition. So it's one of 17, I think it's 17 canvases that Mondrian reworks when he gets to the United States, and we call them the transatlantic paintings. And so you can see what he's done here on the left. What has he added, or what changes has he made? Right, so he adds the blue, he adds the red. Not only does he actually add the red square, but the black square becomes a red square. And he also adds another horizontal black line. And one of the things that he talks about and this may or may not have influenced this work particularly, but he liked the sort of the dynamic bustle of New York City, and he liked the gridded streets of the city as well. And so perhaps this was to add some, some sort of pizzazz, if you will, to the work. He certainly, he did say at one point that he wanted to bring a little boogie-woogie into his work, and of course then he goes on to create the work on the left, which is called boogie-woogie, and then the other work that's in SFMOMA's collection, an unfinished work that was made in New York at the very end of his life, where you can see him thinking about sort of the composition. And one of the things that becomes interesting about that, and is just relevant in terms of thinking about his artistic practice, is that these works are, this is a little bit what we were saying, these works are very much handmade. So you absolutely see, even though in reproduction they look so slick and clean, you actually see the brushwork, or in the work that's on the right, you see the pinholes where Mondrian is actually putting the tape and moving it around. So it is very much this kind of intuitive process for making the work of art. So it looks so calculated, and the way he talks about it is it's so, exact and pure and pristine and so on and so forth. But in fact, the making of it is very much handmade and very kind of intuitive and open to flux and change.
I've got a question, especially with the slide before. I get an optical illusion, so that narrow black strip sort of in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay, it's wider at the top than it is at the bottom.
You know what, that it's not. It's absolutely straight, and I think that's actually my cropping of that image. So it's not
Okay,
quite
but
perfect.
I think it's partly a visual.
But it could be too that that blue anchor at the bottom to make sure that you see that it's the same. That it's
So I just wonder if you talked about optical illusions. I mean, because
no, I think
they
not.
happen, so,
Yeah, no, not that I know of. And certainly not in that way.
Yeah, and
Though one of the things he does do in some of his works is, in this case, the black lines go all the way down to the edge of the canvas. But in some of the works, particularly in the 1920s, they don't. They actually end, sort of maybe like a half an inch or a quarter of an inch from the edge of the canvas. But in that sense, sometimes we would just read it as actually extending all the way down to the edge of the canvas. So he doesn't say, it's an optical illusion, but it's interesting that he does.
It doesn't discuss the way this portrayal and our optic system interact.
Yes, by way of the way that we see things, but not so much. It doesn't actually ever say optical illusion per se, but he's interested in the way that we perceive things. So yes, and the way we look, the way we sort of bring things in through our eye.
It looks like he's going backwards with this piece and the following one, in terms of simplification. And the boogie-woogie looks representational.
Well, and it is interesting how he seems to add more at the very end of his life than in a work like this. So this is done. He goes back to it, and he is.
That's what artists are allowed to do.
Yeah. So he's reworking this piece in 1942, but then by the time we get to Broadway Boogie Woogie, this is 42 to 44. All of these are. So you can see, and I think that he's very much very specifically responding to what he felt was particularly dynamic New York. The music, Boogie Woogie itself, and the dancing. He was apparently quite the dancer, and he was known for going out in New York and really, cutting the rug. Yeah, exactly, cutting the rug, exactly.
Somehow it seems ironic of a guy with no diagonals as a
Look at
dancer.
this image of him on the left, and he's so austere, and he himself is so vertical, and he's always seen, in his suit and tie, in the studio, and his studio is completely organized. It looks just like his paintings. So it's sort of hard to imagine that this guy who looks like he's so completely like type A personality, is out there, cutting it up on the dance floor. I don't know.
I feel like there's just a whole story there, correlation between artist and environment, and
Yeah.
I feel like you could just really, I never saw this before, but you could really make a these words, like that match, like the fascism and the communism and all of that, I mean, it's all reflected in what these artists are doing.
One of the things that we were talking about in our department, in conjunction with the Mark to Supero exhibition, is this relationship between abstraction and politics, particularly, and sort of radical politics. And so there is this kind of correlation. I said abstraction becomes one of the preferred sort of modes for communicating, the spiritual, but it also becomes, particularly in the 20th century, a preferred mode for conveying ideas around sort of radical politics too. Okay, so 1944, Mondrian brought us to the United States, and this is also work from 1944. Part of a series that Georgia O'Keeffe does, where she shows us this deep furrow between two hills. It's an actual location in New Mexico, in the New Mexican desert, that O'Keeffe called the Black Place. So here I'm showing you on the right some snapshots that were taken not by O'Keeffe, but by a friend who was on a summer camping trip with Georgia O'Keeffe to this high desert area in northern New Mexico. So on the top you can see two snapshots of the landscape itself, and then the bottom two images you see there, Georgia O'Keeffe sitting, adjacent to the, in her camp chair and the truck or whatever. Another image of them in the landscape. But one of the things that you will notice, not particularly well in this slide, but when you see the work in person, are these wonderful tiny dabs of green pigment. And so when you see those dabs of green pigment, what comes to mind?
Life.
Yeah, life, exactly. That's exactly it, right? So you've got this barren desert landscape that she's shown us in this, sort of this kind of, these grays and, some mauves. But then you've got these, sort of the improbable, little bits of life. So that even in the most barren, or forbidding of environments, life exists, right? And when O'Keeffe paints her landscapes, she's really setting her focus on the elemental components of the landscape. So there's this sort of intensity through simplification, and this is a theme that we've seen already a lot this evening, this idea of, sort of reduce things down to their essence, and with that then comes a special kind of intensification, or it opens up doors for something more. O'Keeffe first visited Taos, New Mexico in 1929, and following that made annual summer visits to the desert before she finally moved there in 1945, after the death of her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. And she said that she loved the otherworldly aspect of the landscape in particular. She said, "I must have seen the Black Place driving on a trip to the Navajo country, and having seen it, I had to go back to paint, even in the heat of midsummer. It became one of my favorite places to work. As you come over the hill, it looks like a mile of elephants, gray hills all the same size with almost white sand at their feet." And what's actually funny is that I often use this work when I'm touring school groups. And they all say that it's the backs of elephants. So it's kind of interesting when I say, that's so funny you say that, because Georgia O'Keeffe said the same thing about it. So if you think about 1944, even in America, where we think about particularly early American art as being represented by Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton, you've got an artist like Georgia O'Keeffe or Arthur Dove, who's probably considered really sort of the first American artist to have created purely non-representational imagery. And Dove and O'Keeffe actually, they knew each other. Giorgio O'Keeffe credited Arthur Dove really with, as her primary introduction to modern art and abstract art. And this idea that that Dove was particularly interested in, he was influenced by the work of Kandinsky, and he was also influenced by the writings of the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who stressed the importance of a mystical rather than an analytical understanding of the world, and felt that, so Dove is saying that through abstraction you can actually tap into a mystical experience of the world. And I bring these two up, A, because Black Place is in the exhibition, but B, because I think when we think about abstraction in the United States, these are the guys we think about. And it's not really O'Keeffe and Arthur Dove that get the big billing. It's really someone like Jackson Pollock. And of course, not only does Jackson Pollock and his sort of circle of friends and artists, not only do they represent abstraction in America, but they come to represent American painting, American art. So if you're going to, paint in an American style, you're going to paint like Jackson Pollock, or you're going to paint like Willem de Kooning, or you're going to paint like, Robert Motherwell or Franz Klein, or you're going to paint like Rothko or Barnett Newman. And it's, so here you see Jackson Pollock in the Life magazine spread, where Life magazine, sort of headline reads, is Jackson Pollock the greatest living artist anywhere? Doesn't even say in America. Yeah, right. And the thing to note about abstract expressionism is that, and part of the reason that it came to represent American art was really, in large part, the efforts of the two main art critics of the day, Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg, who were really.
And we don't have any pictures of them in the show.
These artists were particularly interested in establishing this kind of American identity for art, and they wanted to create something that was new and innovative. They felt that the best way to represent and express freedom was through individual expression. This sort of psychic self-expression. And so you really hear, in this moment, have the glorification of the sort of the inspired genius artist. And when you see the photographs, and I'll even show you a short video, when you see the photographs of Jackson Pollock out in the big open field, dripping paint all over this massive canvas, and he's completely sort of entranced in this moment of making this work of art, you have this sort of frenzied artistic genius sort of personified in this James Dean kind of character in his black t-shirt and his work boots and the cigarette hanging out of the, the corner of his mouth. But the other thing that becomes important is thinking too about the scale, because the Giorgio O'Keeffe and the Arthur Doves are, sort of easel-sized paintings, and by the time we get to Jackson Pollock, a piece like this is actually a small Jackson Pollock, right? By the time you get to a big drip painting, you're talking about environmental size, room size, installation size kinds of canvases that entirely encompass you. So this work is one of our favorites, so I hope you'll love it as much as we do. This sort of not typical Jackson Pollock, right? This piece is to Pollock's strip paintings as Demoiselles d'Avignon was to Picasso's Cubist paintings. It's a transitional painting. It's a painting that sort of hints at what's to come, while also referencing what was behind him. Jackson Pollock, you may know, was a student of Thomas Hart Benton. And so his early work was very much in that vein. It was very figurative and representational, and it showed, farmers in the Midwest threshing wheat. He also was interested in Mexican muralism and studied with Siqueiros in New York. And so he was particularly interested in sort of the symbolic murals that the Mexican muralists would paint on walls around the United States and also in Mexico. And he was particularly interested in Picasso. And he had a very memorable moment where he went to see Picasso's Guernica when it was at MoMA in New York. And there's this wonderful story that Lee Krasner writes about in her memoirs, where she said that she heard this loud thud come from Pollock's garage shed studio, and she came rushing in to find out what had happened, and she noticed that Pollock had thrown a book of Picasso's across the studio, and when she came in, he says, "God damn it, that guy thought of everything." So, this idea of thinking about, these kinds of inspirations as well as other sources. So when you look at it, what are some of the kinds of things that you see in this sort of not entirely abstract, but not completely figurative work either? You recognize or see anything that you recognize or looks like that?
The distorted figures like the head over on the right-hand side, like from Guernica, and the people on,
Okay, so on the right-hand side, you've got this sort of, this head or this figure, right? Sort of totem almost even.
and the body lying in the bottom.
Okay, something at the bottom. Anyone have body? Anyone else have a like a dog or a wolf, maybe even. So there's a figure, this figurative character at the bottom, this sort of head and figure on the right-hand side.
It looks like a mask, right onto the right, like
Yeah, right? Exactly. I'll get up there and point some of this out. Here, this sort of form, right? So it looks like a mask, and maybe an African mask or something like Demoiselle d'Avignon, and we know that Picasso was looking to African and Iberian masks and sculptures, so this could be some kind of reference to African art or African art via Picasso. And this is that sort of totemic figure we talked about here. I've had some people say it looks like a king, and that this sort of looks like a crown, and it's a figure in profile. Yeah, and like maybe holding a scepter or something, right? And this figure here as kind of a wolf or a dog-like figure. Some people have said it looks like the Egyptian dog, the Egyptian god Re, who's, takes the form of this kind of dog wolf form. What else?
Is that a skeleton sort of on the left?
Oh, this? So maybe another form that's kind of skeletal, right? So could these be maybe ribs or something? Other things?
They're all framing.
Yeah, so when you start to think about these things, they seem to be framing. And what's going on here in the middle? What's that?
The secret.
It's the secret. Okay. What do you see the page saying?
Because you don't know what it's saying.
So you don't know what it says. What do these markings kind of remind you of or look like?
Hieroglyphics.
Like hieroglyphics or some kind of, calligraphic kind of graffiti sort of markings, right? But there's definitely this white rectangular that then is somehow, sort of painted over and encrusted. And when you see this in person, you notice the real tactile quality of the application of paint. It's really worked over. Anyone notice this little sort of figure guy here?
That's a rooster. I was
Yeah, sort of like almost like a roostery figure or something like that, or even this, like a kind of a scarab or a cocopelli sort of. So all of these elements that you're noticing make perfect sense, because we know that Jackson Pollock was particularly interested in Native American art, particularly Native American sand paintings. We know he was interested in hieroglyphics. We know that he was interested in Picasso and Picasso's interest in African masks and Iberian sculpture. And he titles it Guardians of the Secret, and he says about the work that he chooses to veil the image. And so he's intentionally telling us that there's something here that you're not supposed to know, and I'm not letting you in. Yeah.
Did he title it?
And he had a friend who suggested the title, but he titled it, and he took on the title. So,
My first reaction is that that's a scroll.
or maybe, yeah, exactly, like it could be a scroll that's being unrolled in some way, shape, or form.
I thought my first reaction was Torah.
Yeah.
And if I can interject here, this relates to the conversation that we had with docents yesterday about how the context can so impact our understanding of a work of art.
That's
So
right.
we looked at the Felix Gonzalez Torres light bulb installation yesterday, and we talked about the eternal light hanging in a synagogue. We talked about yahrzeit candles as memorials, meanings which we might not ascribe to a Felix Gonzalez Torres piece had we seen it in SFMOMA. So thinking about this piece in the context of this exhibition, of course Jackson Pollock, not a Jewish artist, Gonzalez Torres, not a Jewish artist, but you know, our associations with secrets or documents that are sacred, and we go to Torah scrolls. So that's part of this idea of looking at these works through a different lens. And just because Pollock doesn't say that this is the Torah, doesn't mean that that's something that our visitors, our viewers might bring to it.
And the fact that he specifically says he chooses to veil the image then gives us permission, actually, to then try to make some meaning of it on our own, because he is intentionally, avoiding answering the question specifically. Exactly, he's not going to tell you. And when an artist, intentionally says, "I'm not going to tell you," then what they're also saying is, "I give you permission to, to bring to the work what you're going to bring to it."
So I know about his later process with the putting the canvas on the
Right.
floor and the dripping. Do you know a little bit about his process at this time? Was it just straight brushwork, or is there anything?
So that's a great question. One of the things that we do know also about Pollock in this moment. So really this painting was done in 1943. In 1939, Pollock has a breakdown, which is caused in part by creative blocks, but also alcoholic binges. He's sort of the most famous, alcoholic, tragic death, of the abstract expressionists, although they all seem to die tragically. It's live hard, die fast, and leave a good-looking corpse, or something like that. Die young and leave a good-looking corpse. In the moments before this work was made and leading up to this work, Pollock was going through Jungian psychoanalysis. The psychoanalysis was making him aware of emotions, but also we see him begin to adopt these kinds of symbols, or the symbolic language, into his paintings around this time. So other works made at this time also incorporate these kind of these totems, if you will, these symbols. And these primordial images and images that may have arose from his subconscious. We also know that he's particularly interested in surrealism and automatic drawing. And so the fact that that central sort of scroll, if you will, or tablet or panel seems to be very much almost like it was this kind of subconscious sort of scratching of paint and lines and symbols on the canvas. It's something that scholars have talked about. Seems to foreshadow then, the idea of the drip paintings and that sort of automatic drawing technique. I'm going to allow the paint to drizzle and drip and drop, where it may, as I'm enacting this drama on the canvas. That idea of the drama on the canvas was actually very much Clement Greenberg's kind of description of what Pollock and other abstract expressionist artists were doing. So it's very much this sort of bringing the element of chance into play, but also then calling on these Jungian archetypes and symbols as his painting. But he's still using a brush.
He's still using the brush.
He's still using a brush.
Okay. Thank you.
So he's not yet to the point of eliminating the brush and actually pouring and drizzling, but he's definitely sort of slapping paint on in parts of it.
I'm just going to do a quick time check-in. It's 7:22.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to keep showing, and you know then what Pollock is best known for. By some people who saw the movie for that hurts. Otherwise, a lot of people actually don't know what district paintings look like. So when we think about abstract expressionism, in the one camp you've got someone like Pollock, who would be considered sort of a gestural or action painter, and in the other camp you've got someone like Rothko, best known of course for his hallmark style here, but important to note that his early work was actually very closely related to the early work of Pollock. They look very similar, and they're both tapping into these sort of quasi-figurative motifs that seem to be symbols and symbolic of characters or creatures or beings before they abandon any sort of representation and move entirely to this non-objective abstraction. And as we were talking about over here, one of the things that becomes so important to Rothko is the entire context in which you would encounter the works. So you may know that if you've ever been to Rothko Chapel, that Rothko believed that the best way to encounter his work was in a room that was devoted entirely to his work, where the paintings would become low to the ground. So in essence, you would be absorbed by them and engulfed by them. You could enter into them. They really would be a portal into sort of the next realm. The lighting would be dim, so that these wonderful sort of patches of color would really sort of glimmer and sort of float and maybe sort of what's the word, like to sort of radiate out at you, and so all of this becomes important. And he's another artist who said very specifically that he wanted his works to take you into another realm. He said that, and he was another artist who said that he would not talk about his work. He says, when he was asked about the meaning of his work, he said, silence is so accurate. But he says that he wants his works to be encountered by us, the viewers, so that we're in close quarters, that we're engulfed by them, we're enveloped by them. He said, I paint very large pictures. I realize that historically the function of painting large pictures is painting something very grandiose and pompous. The reason I paint them, however, I think it applies to other painters I know, is precisely because I want to be very intimate and human. To paint a small picture is to place yourself outside your experience, to look upon an experience with a reducing glass. But if you paint larger pictures, you're in it. It isn't something you command. So you're actually engulfed in it, and you are then, sort of transported. He said that people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. And this is interesting because it also applies to his pal Barnett Newman. This is Newman's very early work, where you see the introduction of his sort of hallmark characteristic, that stripe down the center of a one-color painting, a stripe that he called the zip. But when you look at a painting like this, which is over 15 feet wide, the same principle applies. He's painting so large so that you're engulfed, that you're actually surrounded by, that you don't know any other reality than the one that exists within that large canvas. And then it's punctuated by these stripes or these zips, which he said is where the energy is in the works. And so the work that you have in the exhibition is a work that his last finished painting of his life, a work from 1970, where you see that the zips exist as the two white bands on either side of that blue field. And one of the things that becomes interesting here is it's a smaller scale painting, but by painting them white, hanging them in a white gallery, the painting actually extends, beyond the confines of the edge of the canvas, because of course it then becomes part of the environment and again surrounds you.
it's interesting, the largest painting he did, 28 feet, was named after his mother.
Yeah.
So his mother was 28 feet.
Exactly, right. Well, and this piece, you know, the 15, plus feet long painting is the Vir Heroicus Sublimis, right? So the exalted heroic man, who's also, infuses, works with these really interesting titles as well. And then, you have this wonderful sculpture that's in Zoom from 1969, a piece that he said creates a sanctified space for the viewer as you walk through it. So again, you're engulfed and you're surrounded by this piece. He actually had intended the piece to be larger. He wanted it to be 12 feet instead of 8. But it was scaled back because of shipping constraints, because it was created for a sculpture show at a museum in Japan. And so it needed to, just because of shipping constraints, needed to be reduced in terms of scale. So it's sort of interesting too to think about some of those practical things that make a difference in terms of how the final work comes to be. And I brought these two in just to say too that abstract expressionism was a very male-dominated movement, right? All of our great heroic American painters, of this era were men. And it wasn't until the second generation of abstract expressionists, someone like Helen Frankenthaler on the right, or simultaneous with abstract expressionism, what was going on here in California, that we had these, these sort of great female artists represented, in the day. But you can see how both of these artists are still playing with some of the same ideas that Pollock and Rothko and Newman are with Frankenthaler. On the one hand, you've got these wonderful fields of color. On the other hand, she was also particularly interested in the way that Pollock applied paint, the fact that he eliminated the brush altogether and was pouring and dripping paint. So for her work, she's pouring pigment onto an unprimed canvas so it could actually soak in. And someone like Jay DeFeo is particularly interested in that very gestural working of paint. And so you actually see the brush strokes, you see the hand of the artist. She said with this piece, the Veronica, that it's a very, very large piece, and she worked from the top left to the bottom right. And she said that it was so hard for her to actually start the painting because she knew if there was one sort of slip of hand, then she'd ruined the whole canvas and she's going to have to start again. Of course, she ultimately goes on to do a painting like the Rose that she works on for nearly 10 years and would, scrape away all the paint and start it back over. So we know that actually one slip of the hand probably would have stopped her. She was on this piece for 12 years. I think we're running out of time, but I want to just share with you maybe one more trend. If you'll indulge me, and that is just the idea that particularly as we get to the late work, so we're moving away from, you see that all this early work is predominantly abstract, but when you start looking at work from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the idea of the body becomes central to artists again. And so someone like Anna Najeta is actually using her own body, her own impression of the body in the natural landscape to convey ideas of spirituality and emotion in works like this. So here you literally see the body, or reference to her own body. So with this piece that's in the show, it's actually to the scale of her stature. She was about 5 feet tall, and so this is, basically to scale with her body. Or someone like Kiki Smith, you see Lilith perching there in the back right corner. Again, bringing back the body and the figurative, both literally here, but also even implied in works like the Felix Gonzalez Torres, the light bulb piece, which is a reference to people he's lost and loved over his lifetime. So this idea of bringing it back to sort of the corporal as opposed to being completely in your mind and completely sort of in the heavens and in the other realm becomes really important to more contemporary artists. And the physical sensation, so something like Mona Hatoum's pin rub, where literally, if you were to enact with this piece as it's intended, you would be kneeling on all of these upright pins, and it would be painful, right? I mean, you would have a physical response to the work. And I think that that becomes an interesting shift, because so much of what we spent most of the evening talking about is how sort of abstraction and the rejection of the world that we live in was a mode for actually transporting you into another realm. But contemporary artists kind of find a way to bring the body back into it, even when they're dealing in abstract vocabulary, so that it again becomes very visceral and very corporal. And I think that that's an interesting shift that's exhibited in the works that are going to be on view here. So I know we've run out of time, and there's so much more we could say, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you, at any time about things. But if there are any final questions that I can answer in the moment, I'm happy to try to do so.
Anything I'd like to talk about, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
Yeah, we could just stop there for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions for Julie?
I know it's a lot.
Yeah, I think it was a pretty valiant. You pretty much did it. So let's thank Julie for.